We're in the middle of an industrial revolution, right? But what's happening with this industrial revolution is unlike every other industrial revolution has occurred over 3 to 4 generations. What's different this time is the expectation is it's less than 10 years for this transformation to occur. If someone can do a job 40% more effectively, that means they need 40% fewer people. We should not regulate AI itself. It's like regulating Word or Excel. We need to regulate outcomes. AI has far outperformed the S&P. I was doing the math for something the other day. I think it was 23x returns.
Seth, you were the global chief AI officer for IBM. I'm just curious, what was that whole experience like?
Yeah, so that was a great experience for me. So for about 6 years until 2022, I was the global chief AI officer. I was responsible for strategy for across IBM for AI, connecting all the different parts of IBM. Responsible for AI talent at IBM, everything from making sure the definition of what, like a data scientist was consistent for hiring, for diversity engagement, for the talent segment globally for IBM, things like that. I was part of the group of people that set up the IBM AI Ethics Board, which was the first governance board for a Fortune 500 company to be set up. That was super exciting. So, really, a company as big as IBM and as quite honestly as influential in especially in AI governance and responsibility and safety, which is something I'm passionate about. It was quite a learning experience and quite an honor for me to have been in that position for that number of years.
Nice. What drove you to set up the AI ethics board? Was it a problem you were noticing in the industry? I'd love to hear
Yeah.
more.
Like I said, it wasn't just me that set it up. So it was Christina Montgomery and Francesca Rossi. And it was actually Christina that drove to set it up. And it was, she was the chief privacy officer and she saw the writing on the wall for a lot of regulations and a lot of requirements based on what was going on, what inside IBM. And so I was, could say I was the one that had the foresight to set it up, but I wasn't. But I was definitely involved in kind of from a more technical perspective and from a business perspective and ensuring that I got, set up properly and could be executed effectively.
I'd love to hear more about AI ethics in general and where you think regulation should be for these new technologies. Because I hear, I hear a lot of different perspectives. On one hand, you have, and understandably so, people who are very fearful. So particularly, let's say someone's from the US and they're worried that if you overregulate AI, the Chinese will catch up and maybe from their perspective, they're not too trusting of the Chinese government and of Chinese companies. And then on the other hand, obviously, this is a very powerful technology. We're seeing even now the changes that it's making, and it's unbelievably rapid change. And I'd love to get your thoughts on the two sides of that coin and how people should go about thinking about that.
Yeah, and I actually don't like to think about it so much as AI ethics. I like to think about it more as AI safety, because ethics is kind of this nebulous term and it's really hard to define. Safety safety and responsibility are much easier to kind of get your head around. So let's think about it as safety. And I think if we put it in terms of safety, it's much easier to define what we should think about for regulations as well. And I think if you look at it from a safety perspective, and if you go back to Chat GPT being released, and I think if what you look at the EU was about to release for the EU AI Act, I think they were on the right track for regulation. What they were doing was they were regulating outcomes, right? So they were looking at what was going to be the outcome of AI systems. They were not going to regulate the AI systems themselves. OpenAI released ChatGPT, and in a very short period of time, they decided they were going to stuff in regulations around foundation models, which is the basis of generative AI systems like ChatGPT. And so they started regulating AI itself instead of outcomes, which is not what we should do. We should not regulate AI itself. It's like regulating Word or Excel. Those things in and of themselves are not the way the EU is trying to regulate it. Those things in and of themselves are not dangerous. It's the outcome. And so there's two aspects to it, right? And so we need to regulate outcomes. Now, with that said, we do need to have guardrails when we start having races towards things like AGI. So when we start looking at things like, we want to get to AI that has human-like intelligence, whatever that might be. I think there's a lot of ambiguity around what that means and what that is. I think, all of these frontier model companies like OpenAI and Anthropic and Meta have a vested self-interest in saying we're almost there. I don't think the models they're developing are getting us almost there. I think there's a lot of other people that would agree with that. And I don't think their definition of AGI or artificial general intelligence or AGI mimics human intelligence, right? I mean, it doesn't have all the attributes of a human. And even when they say it can reason, it's not really the same way that human reasons. When they say it has the intelligence of a PhD, it doesn't have the intelligence of a PhD. It can regurgitate things like a PhD can. And in fact, a lot of the benchmarks they use, these models are actually trained on. And if you test them in a way that in a way that they're unable to have been trained on the data, that they've been tested on the data that they haven't been trained on, they don't do nearly as well. And so that's been proven that if you test them in a way that they can't have been, the data can't have been trained into the model, they don't do nearly as well. And so, but anyway, I'm going off topic here a little bit. Sorry about that.
No worries.
But from an AI safety perspective, as we move towards this topic of AGI, I think we do need to look at how do we put guardrails in place to protect human autonomy and ensure that when we do get to that point of AGI, that the systems respect humans. Because once we do cross that threshold, whenever it is, like for real, like when humans can have a conversation, like for real, an emotional conversation, a thoughtful conversation, when they can start creating new things, when AI can start doing that, within a year or two after that, AI will be much smarter than us. It will get to super intelligence. And if AI is not contained in a way that it has our best interest in mind, that's a scary time. And so that's different than the type of regulation that people are talking about today. Right? So that's safety. That's not regulation.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think that, we've already seen how transformative this technology is. It seems to be moving even faster. I've been on top of, I'm on X and I'm seeing all the updates. And then it seems like in the last 3 months, we've had 10 years of progress. It's just been ridiculous. I want to talk more about, so you mentioned we should have these safety measures, these guardrails in place. Specifically, what guardrails do you think would be best that you think a lot of governments aren't regulating so far?
Yeah. So I think that's a really good question. And I think that's part of the problem is we don't know what they are exactly. I think there's a lot of really smart people that are working on those. But there are a few things for sure that we know we need to look at. So one is we need some way to understand how AI is operating, like really, really. So that's one thing. I'm not saying explainability or transparency, but some type of interpretability, right? And so that's one thing. The other thing is we need some way
to reliably turn off an AI. And reliably is once an AI gets smarter than us, can it figure out a way to defeat that, right? So how do we ensure that that the AI is unable to defeat that? So there needs to be some kind of rule that when people are building these systems, it's hard coded in that, Mr. or Mrs. AI, you cannot bypass this, this kill switch, if you will. And so there need to be things like that put in place to help, ensure that we remain in control and that we understand what's going on, because those are, at the very least, those are two really important things. Now, there are people, much smarter than I am and much deeper in this space that are working on these things. And really trying to define what they look like and which they should look like. And there's conversations going on at places like the Global Partnership on AI and the OECD to really provide recommendations as to what they should be, what these types of safety measures should be.
Yeah, no, I think things being clear is a big thing. And you said, even when I asked you the previous question, you were talking about AGI and everyone promising AGI. It's 100%. People don't even know what is AGI even. I still don't even. There's no clear definition, at least in my eyes. I want to talk about. So you've mentioned a lot of things there that I think can be quite scary for someone young. I'm 20. I'm in my third year of university, and when I speak to a lot of my friends, they're very, very nihilistic on the job market, on the outlook of society. I have one friend who's applied to maybe 300 firms and gotten to several final stages, but found it really, really challenging. And a lot of my friends still haven't been able to land jobs the final year of university. What should, I guess, young people make of this? What should we make of, I guess, feeling powerless? I was just thinking, ChatGPT was released December 2022. It's been 2 years and 4 months around since that point. The rate of improvement has been so fast. If things continue to improve at this rate, will the skill set of my generation be able to catch up with that rate of improvement? And to be honest, how should we even go about thinking about these difficult things?
Yeah, I think this is a problem not just for your generation. So I think if you look at where we are today, right, we're in the middle of an industrial revolution, right? So we're in the middle of another industrial revolution. But what's happening with this industrial revolution is unlike any other industrial revolution. Every other industrial revolution has occurred over 3 to 4 generations. A generation is at least 15 years. So bare minimum, you're looking at 45 years, right, for the transformation to occur, for the transformation in the job market. So bare minimum, you have a full cycle of someone going through of a job market to go through, right? So of people being born, going through an educational system, right, and literally entering and exiting a job market almost, right? And so, you have that time for the whole workforce to transform. What's different this time is the expectation is it's like less than 10 years for this transformation to occur. And we're seeing that in real time right now, right? And so not only is it impacting your generation, it's impacting people my age, right? I mean, there's people in their 50s that are out of work, right? There's that still we're planning on working, right? People are expecting to work until their 70s nowadays. And so it's not just people in their 20s, it's people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and even into their 60s that need to work, need to find jobs, that are trying to figure out what do you do in this day and age. And I think, and so you're not alone, number one. So, that may not be what you want to hear, but you're not alone. And I think part of the problem is
One, when you hear this conversation about job replacement and augmentation, I think to a certain extent, they're the same thing. From a corporate perspective, if someone can do a job 40% more effectively, that means they need 40% fewer people. So augmentation is the same thing as replacement, right? So let's just be honest. So that's two things going on. One is just kind of double speak. So we just need to be honest about that. Now, what do you do about this? I think number one, you need to embrace these tools. You need to figure out how do you use them effectively, and how do you set yourself apart from everyone else. And so that's one thing. And I think that's historically been kind of a cliche. If you look back the last 10, 15 years, there's been this kind of saying that came out, someone from, I don't know, it depends on who you say. Someone said someone from Harvard or MIT, or someone said this, it started with managers who use data will replace, data, AI won't replace managers, but managers who use AI will replace those who don't, right? And it kind of went back, started with data and things like that. But I think it's never been more true now that, people who learn to use AI effectively will be the ones that have jobs. And people who don't will be struggling. So I think that's one thing, is you need to learn how to use these tools effectively, how to how to be the one that is augmenting themselves with AI. I think the other thing is you may need to reevaluate what you're doing for your career, because there's certain things that, at least in the near term, AI is not going to be able to do. We're not yet near what we call embodied AI, right? Embodied AI is where AI can actually physically do things effectively, right? So you can get a robot that can pick up my microphone, right? But if something is moving around my microphone, it can't adjust for that, right? So we don't yet have embodied AI. So, more manual, more what we used to think about as more blue collar type jobs like plumbers, electricians, things like that. Those are jobs that are going to be more stable, right? May not be what your moms and dads and grandparents want you to do, but if you're looking for stability, those are going to be more stable in the long run. Coding jobs, those are probably going to be some of the first to go. Those are very easy to replace. Anything highly analytical is going to be easy for AI to replace. But I think embrace AI, learn how to use it effectively, make it part of your day. I mean, I use it constantly, all the time, nonstop. Makes me a better, more effective at everything I do.
100%. I mean, I use it as well. Like I've been using it all the time to write emails. And one of the things you mentioned there, and I think it's so crazy, because 5 years ago, if you'd said this, it would have been the most contrarian take of all time. The fact that AI ended up coming for your analytical thinking jobs before the physical labor, blue collar jobs. I remember in high school, the teachers would say, analytical jobs won't be automated. Learn how to think very well. Programming is a job that'll be here a while. And in fact, one of the things that struck me, this is at the start when ChatGPT first came out, was, there were a lot of these software engineering YouTubers, and they'd test the tools, and they'd say, oh, it still can't do this. It makes a lot of errors here. But I found that, fundamentally, that's a bet that tech's never going to get better, that this is as good as we're going to get. And for the rest of history, it's always going to stay at this level. And so maybe with databases, it's not so good. But fundamentally, that's a bet against innovation. I want to ask about, we've covered the rapid progress
And I want to know more about what you're doing with, I guess, with your venture studio. And then we can also talk about your VC fund, because clearly this is transformative technology. How are you trying to invest in it? Where do you think the value is going to be accrued in the space?
Yeah. So, I mean, so I'm actually, so I actually think the technology that Chat GPT and these similar types of tools are built on is kind of maxed out.
But you think so?
Um,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. So this what's called transformer architecture is not going to get us too much further. Um, and so, we are not really interested in investing much in this type of architecture. So we're looking beyond this. So we're looking at new types of algorithms. So we're looking, at net new math, if you will. We're looking at new hardware paradigms. So how can we go beyond GPUs to things that are several orders of magnitude faster than GPUs, more energy efficient, that can operate more on the edge, like truly on the edge, that can have as much compute efficiency in the size of your fingernail, maybe be power neutral, not require much of any power at all. Um, and maintain privacy. So look at the intersection of Web3 and AI so that there's ownership and privacy and safety of individual data and AI, or corporate individual companies' data and AI. So those are really the types of things that we're looking at, and also small models. So the only transformer, which is, again, that's the basis of Chat GPT and those types of, it's called a transformer architecture. The only types of those architecture look at are small models. So today, Chat GPT and others are racing towards like hundreds of billions or trillions of parameters, think of those are the type that's just the measure that they use of the size. We're looking at, like maybe hundreds of millions at the most. So very, very small, that actually outperform Chat GPT 4.0 or maybe even 0.1 on the tasks that they're being trained on. And these are interesting because for a variety of reasons. Number one, they're safer because they're trained on private data. They're more aligned with regulations. They can be deployed at the edge. They actually hallucinate at a much lower rate. So they mitigate a lot of the issues that underlie with these bigger models. And so that's why we would look at some of those.
What's the most interesting investment been in, if you're allowed to speak about it? And whatever some of the more promising technologies that you think can surpass the previous generation stuff?
Yeah, so the most interesting ones are probably in the hardware. So one of them's in the hardware space that I kind of alluded to. I can't talk too much about it. The other one is is in the small model space that I mentioned outperforms GPT 4.0 on the tasks that it's trained on, very, very small models. And then there's a third one it's called a world model. Basically, it models everything simultaneously. So think about being able to, think of like Chat GPT, like a language model that can simultaneously model everything. But this one is based on physics. And so it can simultaneously model physics, everything about physics all at once. Now, if you can simultaneously model all of physics all at once, right? Everything that has a physical presence on Earth is built on physics. That's incredibly impactful, right? So now you can make a true digital twin of almost anything. And so those are probably some of the most impactful investments.
Yeah, I realized I asked about what you were doing, but I didn't really ask about the story and how you started One Infinity and Silicon Sands. What were, I guess, those two things? I guess it's two questions, two separate companies. What was that whole like? What are you trying to accomplish with both of those two ventures?
Yeah. So Silicon Sands is actually a venture studio within One Infinity. So they're actually one and the same. So, I've been in the AI space since the mid 90s. So since graduate school. And I've been my my partners and I have been working in the space for a long time. We've all been deep in some version of this space and contributing into it for a long time. As two of us, so there's three partners. As two of us are kind of later in our career, one of the things we're really want to do is make sure that we leave AI in a good space, right? For your generation, especially, right? And for our, I have kids that are a little bit older than you, but not much. That we leave AI in the world in a better space when it comes to AI. And a big part of that is making sure that AI is safe, and that it's responsible. And One Infinity and Silicon Sands, a core part of our investment thesis is that all of these things that we invest in are developed safely and responsibly. So we're a deep tech or an early stage deep tech AI fund, but we evaluate all of our investments for safety and responsibility, and we won't make the investments if they're not. Don't fall in line with that. And so that's really why we're doing it, is because it's part of us leaving a legacy of safety, AI safety.
I want to talk about, so this is kind of a side rail, but it's something that I've always been interested in. And I try to ask this to people who are involved in the venture capital business, because I see a lot of these huge VCs, Sequoia, for example, and on their website, they publish the returns. And for the last, I think since 2010, their returns have been the same as the S&P 500. They've lost to the NASDAQ. And that's all while being illiquid, and investing in high risk assets. It's a company can go bust tomorrow. The portfolio theoretically could go to zero, and that's much more likely than, for example, the market tanking to zero. What is the value in a VC investment? And why do these endowments, why do these huge allocators, why do they allocate to VC?
Yeah, so AI actually has not followed that trend. So AI has far outperformed the S&P. So AI has not followed that trend at all. So I think that this is a completely different conversation when you look at VC versus AI, venture versus AI venture, especially early stage. So early stage, you're looking at, if you look at a pre-seed investment, you're looking at on average 40. I think I did actually was doing the math for something the other day. I think it was like a 43x return over 10 years. It's not quite crypto like returns, but it's still pretty good.
Not too bad.
Yeah, I'm sorry. No, it was 23x returns. 23x returns.
No, not too bad.
Yeah. It's not, it's not crazy returns. You're not looking, I think I was comparing it to crypto. Crypto was, I think 10,000x returns over the same time frame. But 23x is pretty good.
Do we think that most of the value, in the future, do we think most of that's going to be generated by NVIDIA, the big tech companies, versus like private, smaller AI firms who are doing, innovating on maybe on top of the foundation models for different use cases? I'd love to hear more about that.
So I think in the short term, in the next 3 years, the same companies are going to be generating the value. So I think you're going to see NVIDIA, Meta, Apple, OpenAI, Anthropic, Microsoft, generating the vast majority of the value. I think, in 3-5 year time frame, I think you're going to see those companies get their value cannibalized by what are now stealth or little known startups that are developing newer technologies that either people like Jensen at NVIDIA are dismissing, that is saying that are too far off to be feasible. I think, as I mentioned, there's new algorithms that are being developed that companies like OpenAI and Anthropic are not focusing on, that I think
and Meta are not focusing on that I think are going to far surpass the current architecture that they're all working on. And so, and many of these founders are aware that, you know, if they make a decision not to sell, they'll probably be better off in the long run. And so some of them, these companies may want to buy them, but they'll have to make a super, a really, really good offer to convince these founders to sell. And so maybe they will, maybe they won't. So I think you're going to start seeing in like 3 years' time, you'll start seeing these companies' value get cannibalized by what are today, for most people, non-existent companies.
We spoke a bit earlier in the conversation about blue collar ending up being the more stable route for people, stable jobs. And that was a very contrarian take. And I remember Sam Altman tweeting about it. And no one believed him at the time. Do you have a take that's similar in nature that you think, within the AI space today, something that most people probably don't agree with?
I think the contrarian take I have for the industry is that, transformer architectures are maxed out. There's little to no new value in them. And that these models really, that maybe not, some people might say it's contrarian or some people can't, but this whole concept of these model reasoning is a bunch of BS. They don't really reason. It's pseudo reasoning, it's just marketing. So, I think, yeah.
Can I ask you to expand on that? Because I remember watching a video of, I think it was Ilya Sutskever, and he was talking about, talking about how you can get actual reason from a transformer model. So you have the example he talks about is you have a mystery book, who's the murderer, and it's all these, it's the entire story. It's what who was seen doing what, who was seen doing, something else. And it remains unsolved by the end, but you plug that into a transformer model and somewhat it comes up with the most likely guy. What are your thoughts on that? And why do you think that, that's not, I guess, why isn't that reason? I'd just love to learn more.
Yeah. So if you give logic problems to these models, even ones that they've been trained on, right? There's multiple types of reasoning, right? But let's just give like logic problems. You give very simple logic problems to these models. They can do them. And these are logic problems off the internet. So these models have been trained on these logic problems. So they're in their training data set. They've seen them before. You give simple logic problems to them, they can do them 100% of the time. You give medium difficulty logic problems to them, they can do them most of the time. You give them a hard logic problem, they can do them some of the time. You give them a very hard logic problem, they can rarely do them. Now, mind you, again, these are logic problems. You go on the internet, you search for logic problems with the answers. So these models, the data that they're trained on comes from the internet. They have seen the logic problems, they've seen the answers, they've been trained on them, yet they still can't do them. So that right there in and of itself tells you they can't reason because they can't reason through these logic problems that they know the answer to.
Was that the same from, I guess, GPT 3.5 to 4 to 4.0 to 0.1 to 0.3?
Yeah, so 3.5 couldn't do any logic problems, right? So they've gotten progressively better. And part of that is because of this thing called Goodhart's law. Goodhart's law means that, when you start having a metric and you start chasing towards it, the metric becomes worthless, because that's all you chase. Because people have been calling this out as a problem, they've been training more and more towards this. And so, this gets to another measure of reasoning and another measure of the actual intelligence of these models. The best way to actually measure these models is to not use static measurements, but to use dynamic measurements. And so Apple, I lost the paper that they did. I can find it, but they have an API that they generated, and they dynamically produce tests for these models. And when they dynamically produce tests, meaning that the models can't have been trained on the test, these models all perform really, really poorly, right? And then when they throw perturbations in the system, right, they perform even worse. And so Apple also concluded from this test that the transformer architecture will never be able to reason based on this. And we're talking like 60% worse than they claim to score on the actual tests. And so, it's significantly worse when you do it this way. And so there's a lot of evidence that shows that these transformer architectures just do not have the capacity to reason.
Well, I don't think that's something that's talked about a lot. I mean, when I'm on Twitter X, I see, AGI, I saw people promising AGI and in a really short time frame. People don't even know what that is. And I think you also did speak earlier about it's in their financial best interest to do that. I mean, they can raise more money. They can, the stock goes up, right? And they can hire more talent to build more, to maybe do better, to make even bigger promises. And it's this cycle.
Sorry, it's called GSM Symbolic is the name of so Apple, it's the name of the paper. If you just Google GSM Symbolic, the paper will come up, but that's the name of the test they run.
Okay, GSM Symbolic. And I do have a question about that whole thing. Do you think we're living in some sense, AI has been super transformative even to date, but in some sense, I want to hear from your perspective. You're on the investing side. And you've also built in this space. How do you think we're living in a bubble right now? Do you think the stocks can go down? Do you think the valuations will come down? Do you think they'll continue to shoot upwards?
Well, I think we're seeing stocks go down because of I think it's forced stocks going down because of the instability or ambiguity of what's going to happen with tariffs and things like that. I don't think we're going to see, I don't think we're in an AI bubble. I think that we're still going to see things going up. I think we're still on an upswing. So I don't think we're in an AI bubble yet. I think the valuations are still fairly real. They're not so far off everything else. So I don't think so.
And with the US and China, so this is talking a bit about some of the stuff I've heard you speak about. I think it was on the Better Tech podcast. We have essentially two nations sprinting at this. And really, as far as I'm concerned, it looks like those are the only two nations where it looks to be really, really competitive. I do worry that these models, more and more, we're living in a winner take all world where the number one player takes almost everything, or at least the top players. How should smaller tech, how should smaller nations, I guess, even try to participate in this race? And is it even possible for them to do such a thing?
Yeah. So I think, I think there's other nations that are participating effectively. So France is participating very effectively. So you have Minstrel, and Stability and Hugging Face are all French companies. If Stability ever recovers, right? So remember, Stability was the first generative AI unicorn, Stability AI. Minstrel's doing quite well. In the Emirates, you have the Technology Innovation Institute. They're about to release another model called Falcon 3. that's expected to produce expected to be on par with, our DeepSeek R2 or R3. So in the Middle East, you have a model that's doing as well. And so, what I so we do have this battle between the big, the US and China, but we have other players in the space. What I often talk about, though, is the people who are building these models, right, are and the big power centers, even though we have these other players, the big power centers are still the US and China. And primarily the people building these models are people from San Francisco and Beijing, right? And they have a perspective of San Francisco and Beijing. And even when you go to the Middle East, it's a lot of primarily people from San Francisco and Beijing, and maybe some people from India that are building these models. And so my concern is really that we have a single or dual-minded view building these models. So that's my biggest concern, is you have this incredibly powerful technology that's going to influence the whole world, that you have very little of the world participating in influencing the perspective of this technology, right? So that's one concern I have. And so I talk about that a lot, and I think that's one of the things I talked about on the Better Tech podcast. Now, I do think, though, DeepSeek coming out. So the U.S. has always been seen as being, very, very far ahead of everyone else until DeepSeek R2 came out. And by the way, DeepSeek was not an unknown. Everyone knew about DeepSeek. They came out with a paper about a year ago with R1 talking about some of the methodologies that they used in R2, but they had not been implemented as effectively as they were in R2 and R1. Now, I do think it's a great thing that someone else outside the US has developed a model that is as effective as a US model, because I think it helps provide some balance. It helps provide another perspective. So you have a Chinese language model, primarily Chinese language model, providing diversity into a primarily English or Western language model. Because remember, OpenAI's models are primarily trained on the Western internet. DeepSeek's models primarily trained on the Chinese internet. So now you're getting multiple perspectives brought in there. Now, with that said, there's a whole lot of evidence that DeepSeek did do something called distill. So they basically extracted a lot of the base model from OpenAI, from GPT-4o, to start their model. Now, do I think there's anything wrong with that? Well, let's put it in context. So they took an API off the internet, and they used that API that was off the internet under something called fair use. Now let's look at what OpenAI did to train their model. They went around and they took a whole bunch of data off the internet, and they said, hey, this is on the internet, it's fair use. So in my mind, DeepSeek did the same exact thing, ignore the licensing parameters on OpenAI's API. OpenAI ignored all the licensing parameters on all the data on the internet, and they trained their model. So they did the same exact thing. And in fact, 10 days before DeepSeek released R2, some graduate students in Stanford released a model called Sky that performed a little bit, not quite as well as R2 did, but everyone thought it was great, and theirs was only cost $450 to train. But no one cared about that because it was some graduate students in Stanford. And so, but I think it's a good thing because it demonstrates, what capability. So some new capabilities. They do have new technology that they implemented on top of it. They did demonstrate that it could be done, and others are looking at using it now too. So,
net, I think it was a good thing. Yes, they did distill it. Is there anything wrong with it? No.
I want to hear more about like what do you think are the specific issues that will come about from the models being built on really only two perspectives, two worldviews?
Yeah. So there's a few issues with it. So let's talk about something like bias. And this also gets into regulations like the EU AI Act. But bias is actually a social construct, right? What we think about as bias in the US and what the Chinese think about as bias are two completely different things. What the Indian society think about as bias is different. What societies in Africa think about as bias are different things. And so just based on that alone, outside of gender bias, I think for the most part, we all agree that there shouldn't be any gender bias, right? But so, just from a perspective of bias alone, right? When we build these models, inherently, we're trying to control bias in these models. But we're inherently trying to control our perspective of bias, right? And so, but we don't understand other societies. So that's just one aspect. Now throw the EU AI Act on top of that. The EU wants people to control their perspective of bias. So now the EU, in trying to do good, are inflicting the EU's perspective of bias on these models on the rest of the world. So now you have someone who's trying to do good, making it even worse. So that's one aspect of it. The other thing is you have a bunch of what is primarily a bunch of white and Chinese dudes, right? So people that look like you and I, being the primary people that are building these models that the rest of the world is supposed to get value from. Now, you and I have our life experiences, right? But our life experiences do not represent the life experiences of everyone on Earth, right? And people's life experiences influence how they approach problems, influence their perspective of how they build things, and also influence how they approach what they're concerned about. And all of those things impact the result of what is going to happen with these models when they're built and influenced. And so if you have a homogeneous group of people or relatively homogeneous group of people building these models, number one, you're not going to get as good of an outcome because you're not going to have as diverse a group of thought. Number two, you're more likely to have problems arise down the road that are not good for society.
What can be done about it? Like, is there any hope for a third competitor? Or, I mean, it's a very it takes a lot of capital to train these foundation models. Is there anything that others can do?
Yeah. So, well, then there's another problem that I didn't mention in that, these models are trained off the internet, right? Primarily data off the internet. There's large swaths of the globe that don't have a lot of connectivity to the internet. A lot of historical data from parts of India, which is the most populous country in the world, right, is just now getting connectivity to the internet. So 2-3 years ago, it was one of the least connected parts of the world. So you have the most populous country in the world having historically one of the least amounts of data on the internet. Africa has very little connectivity. Parts of South America. So you have basically the global South has little representation in these models. So one thing we can do is make sure that the global South gets better data representation in these models. And so we need to help the global South get better connectivity, but without strings attached. So in the past, you've seen Meta, you've seen Starlink put, free internet, quote unquote, free internet in these places, but it wasn't free. There were strings attached. We need to figure out how we get internet connectivity to these parts of the world really, really without strings, right? And we're starting to do that. So,
Gen Z that came out of India, for instance, and are doing very well now, or millennials that came out of India that are doing well in the West, are starting to invest their time and money back in India to make sure that connectivity is no longer an issue, right? So you're seeing an increase, an uptick in connectivity in India because of that. We're starting to see a similar trend in Africa. So we're starting to see that uptick in connectivity because the kids, because I'm old, the kids that are going back are starting to ensure that, their family can communicate with them is really what it is. They want their communities to be able to communicate with them. So that problem's getting solved. So the data problem's getting solved. Now it comes to an education problem, because even if the countries can't build them, if there's people that can participate, that's a good thing. But then you just have a sheer numbers problem, right? China is the second most populous country in the world. We can get more people from India because that's the most populous country. So there should be more people from India participating, because that's by numbers, by percent, that should be the most populous. And so I think at the very least, what we should be marching towards is representation. And this should not be a hard thing to do. Representation by percent of population on Earth in people building these models, right? And that's just an education. And, it doesn't have to be in those countries, right? But they should be represented at the Technology Innovation Institute in the UAE, at Minstrel, at Stability in France, at all these different companies. I'm not concerned that I would love for them to be in all these countries, but let's not even start there. Let's just start at getting these people at the places that have the money to do this. Let's start getting that thought in the places that have the money. That's a place to start.
You're clearly Seth, you're clearly a very mission-driven person, and you talked about how you have some kids. Do you try to instill that same drive to help the world, whether that's in something like AI or in whatever it is they want to do in them? I guess it's just a question to wrap things up. How do you raise your kids to tackle all these problems?
I don't know. It's a question for them, I guess.
No worries. No worries. Yeah. But thank you so much, Seth. I think that's a perfect place to end it. Yeah. You shared some great insights about AI safety, the world we want to build with AI, and also where you think opportunity is headed. Thanks so much. And look forward to maybe chatting sometime in the future.
Yeah. Thanks, Ethan. Nice to meet you.